All right, everyone, welcome to our webinar. My name is Andrew Townsend, and I'm Marketing Operations here at Smarty. Thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is about the most common mistakes made when calling Smarty's APIs, and we're very excited to get started and just dive right in. However, before I introduce our presenter, allow me to go over just a couple housekeeping items here. One, this webinar will be recorded. It's recording right now. We'll send a copy of this recording to everybody who registered, so you can be looking for that in your email inbox within the probably today, maybe tomorrow, or next couple of days. Depends how fast we can get it up. So we'll send it to you as soon as it's ready. This also means that you'll be able to review it at a later time. If you need to check out, you can step out a little bit early. You can review that or forward it on to those who you think may benefit from the content here. Second, to interact with our presenter and the other audience members, please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A features in the Zoom webinar interface. That's the best way that we can communicate with you. We will be ready to take your questions to our presenter or answer anything that we can. We want to make sure that you get out of this webinar what you're hoping to get out of it. All right, so our presenter today is Lyle Durland, our support team lead. Thanks, Lyle, for your time. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. So coming to you from a small closet slash video booth right next to our support room here at Smarty. Let's just jump in. We're going to talk about common mistakes. We won't talk about all possible mistakes, but I'm going to hit the most common ones. In today's webinar, we're going to cover two types of mistakes: authentication required errors, status code 401, and payment required errors, status code 402. There are several different flavors of those errors, and we're going to, and we see those fairly commonly, and they're the most common types of errors we see, and we're going to go over them today. So then, starting with the authentication required errors, status code 401. In this section, we're going to cover how to authenticate API requests the right way, how it's supposed to work, and then we'll go into common mistakes in client-side requests to the API, and then finally common mistakes in server-side requests to the API. So step one in authenticating correctly, I'd recommend that you get familiar with your account's API keys page. Hopefully you're able to log into your Smarty account, the Smarty account you're using, and see that. In the next slide here, I've got a little screenshot of an API keys page with the keys themselves redacted a little bit here. In the API keys page, you'll see two parts. The top part is embedded keys, and the bottom portion is secret keys. You're allowed to have up to 100 embedded keys and 100 secret key pairs. So obviously the one you're looking at here is very simple. You'll notice that under the embedded keys title, you'll see that embedded keys are only for client-side code, as opposed to down below, the secret keys are for server-side code. And we'll get into real specifically what that means. You'll notice that with the embedded keys, for any key, and the embedded keys are just numeric values, for any key, you will list at least one host. You can list up to 100 hosts per key. Down below with the secret keys, when you create secret keys, you have the opportunity to label them. So if you want to, for example, label them, one of them testing environment and one, a certain kind of production environment, and then another different production environment, you can label your secret key pairs to help you keep track of what, which ones are being used in which environments. So there's your API keys page. It's going to be really important that you, as developers, have access to this page. We do sometimes find out about people, developers who haven't been given access to this page. Obviously, that's ultimately up to whoever has created the Smarty account. But we would highly recommend that you have access to this page so that you can manage API keys yourself rather than have to go through someone else that's administering the account. Anyway, that's the API keys page. Just a quick overview there. The next step in authenticating API requests the right way is to understand the difference between client-side requests, which are in a web browser, versus server-side requests. Since browsers send a referrer header automatically, our system treats any request that includes a referrer header as a client-side request. In contrast, if the request does not have a referrer header, our system treats it as a server-side request. That's an important distinction to make. If you're working in a browser, this referrer header is going to be sent automatically, and we're going to expect to see an embedded key in that case. You will see certain examples in a couple of future slides where, we'll get there, but in mobile apps, that's also a use case for embedded key, but the mobile app doesn't send a referrer header automatically. Same with working in Postman. We'll see this also in a slide in a couple of minutes. In working in Postman, if you're using the secret keys, you're fine. You don't have to set anything up. Postman does not send a referrer header. And so if you're working in Postman and want to use an embedded key to emulate a client-side kind of context, you will have to manually set up a referrer header in order for the embedded key authentication to work. Anyway, that's number 2. Let's move to number 3. Oh, sorry, got a slide here, a little screenshot of an example. This is Chrome opening the network tab of the developer tools, and just seeing that under the section called request headers, of all the headers, one of them that is almost always sent is the referrer header. This is sent automatically by the browser, and it's going to be important that you be familiar with this. Notice in this case, the referrer value, www.smarty.com. Moving on. So now we're gonna talk about the right way to do client-side calls versus the right way to do server-side. So for client-side calls, 2 main steps: include an embedded key in the request URL. The embedded keys are always just simple numeric value, and you can use key equals and the numeric value right in the URL. And then the second part of it is make sure that the referrer value sent by the browser is listed as a host for the embedded key. That is how you know what to list as the host value for the key. Obviously, you can list, as I mentioned before, you can list many host values for any one key. But whenever you're working in a browser just find out what the referrer, be really aware of what that referrer value is. That's what needs to be listed as a host for the key. And that's basically, if you get those 2 things right, then your client-side authentication will work. Okay, and then finally, for server-side calls to work, they're even simpler. Just make sure to include the secret keys, auth ID and auth token, in the request URL. So auth ID equals and auth token equals right in the request URL. Now we're going to jump into problems. Common mistakes. First, we'll talk about common mistakes in client-side requests, and then in a minute, we'll talk about common mistakes in server-side requests. Client-side requests, we tend to see more errors in client-side requests. Let's jump into what some of those things are. Obviously, don't submit secret keys in a client-side request. You're going to use an embedded key in a client-side request. You definitely get a 401 status code if you try to send secret keys in a client-side request. So if you're sending, if we detect a referrer header, we're thinking client-side request, and we expect to see an embedded key. And if we see secret keys, you'll get a 401 authentication error. Next common mistake: don't list the wrong referrer host value with the embedded key. Notice that, and I've kind of zoomed in on the refer shot that I showed you before. Just look between the slashes and see that the referrer value to list as a host is simply www.smarty.com. In this case, you don't need the HTTPS. It does make a difference, www versus not. For example, smarty.com is different than www.smarty.com. So it is particular in that way. You just want to look between the slashes and list the referrer value that way. As we'll see in a slide coming up, it is possible to use a wildcard, an asterisk, to represent one level of subdomain. Anyway, let's jump into the next one. These are just a couple of little side notes related to getting the refer host value right. If you're working in localhost, just list localhost as the host. Don't include the port number, just plain localhost will work. Obviously, that's not completely secure, and so we only recommend doing that while you're in an initial development phase, using localhost as the host name. Once you're done with that phase, you'd probably want to remove localhost as a registered host for the embedded key. And then finally, this in the context of JS Fiddle, if you're on the JS Fiddle website and you're working, you're sending a request from there, if you have put in your own embedded key into the code, if you're passing your own embedded key in that JS Fiddle code, you'll get a 401 unless you have the right referrer value for JS Fiddle listed in your API keys page, and that the correct host for that is fiddle.jshell.net. So make note of that if you like using JS Fiddles. Okay, next common mistake is related to wildcards. When using a wildcard in a host name, don't use the asterisk for more than one level of subdomain. So for example, if the complete referrer value is www.accounts.smarty.com, correct would be to use the asterisk to replace only one level of subdomain. So correct would be asterisk.accounts.smarty.com. It would be incorrect to try to use the asterisk to represent two levels of subdomain, asterisk.smarty.com in this case. So keep that in mind. The asterisk can represent exactly one level of subdomain. If you try to use the asterisk to represent multiple levels of subdomain, you will get the authentication error. Let's see, what do we have next? Yeah, another common mistake in client-side requests. I mentioned these before, but in the context of mobile apps and Postman, don't forget to explicitly set up a referrer header when calling from a mobile app or when using an embedded key in Postman. That's because mobile apps and Postman don't send a referrer header by default like browsers do. So you would need to set up one manually in order for authentication to work. You're going to use, with a mobile app, you do want to use an embedded key, but you're going to manually set up a referrer header. Now understand the referrer value can be almost anything, just as long as it's listed as a host paired with the key you're using. Same with Postman, the referrer value you set up there can be almost anything as long as that value is listed as a host for the key you're using. And finally, in terms of common mistakes for client-side requests, don't forget to URL encode the request URL. A common problem we see is especially if people forget to URL encode and there's a pound symbol, a number symbol in the request. A pound symbol, a number symbol that is not URL encoded will break up the request URL, and our system will not recognize any part of the URL after the pound symbol. So if your URL has authentication credentials listed after a pound symbol that's not URL encoded, our system is not even going to see the authentication credentials. A URL encoded pound symbol or number sign, by the way, is %23. We recommend that with any programming language, there are standard libraries, I think, to URL encode the request that you're sending, and then you won't have any issues that way. All right, switching gears to common mistakes in server-side requests. This one should be fairly easy to grasp by now. Don't send an embedded key in a server-side request. In a server-side request, we're expecting to see the secret keys. Don't type the auth ID or auth token by hand. You'll get those, of course, by looking at your API keys page. You definitely want to copy and paste those. If you try to do it by hand, you might mistype a 1 for a lowercase l or a 0 for a capital O. Occasionally, we see these kinds of errors where people have manually typed the auth ID or auth token, and they've missed something like that. So definitely recommend copying and pasting those values into your code. And similar to, we also saw this one with client-side requests, but don't forget to URL encode the request URL. All right, I think that wraps up common mistakes in server-side requests. Server-side is typically easier to grasp, and we see fewer errors on server-side. The most common 401s we see are related to the referrer value when working with client-side requests. All right. Shifting gears a little bit now, we're going to talk about 402s, payment required errors, status code 402. So in this section, we're going to cover understanding your Smarty account and your licenses. Just having a general understanding of those things will help you get things right related to and avoid payment required errors. And then we'll go through common mistakes that you might make that result in a payment required error. So jumping in understanding your Smarty account and your licenses, I kind of briefly mentioned this before. If you are a developer trying to work with the Smarty APIs, we recommend that you be able to log into the Smarty account you're trying to use. Understand that currently each Smarty account has only a single login email and password, so you would need to obtain those login details from whomever has them. We are working on, it's on a roadmap to establish the ability to have multiple sign-ons, multiple logins per account. We don't have that yet, but that's something that's coming in the future. At the moment, each account you only log in with a single login, email, and password. So I'd recommend you get that from whoever has it so that you can be familiar with the account. Specifically, be familiar with the different pages available, especially the subscriptions page and the API keys page. In the subscriptions page, you'll be able to see the history of subscriptions. You'll be able to see, for example, given a certain subscription, what is the exact license value you're supposed to use in the request? That's all in the subscriptions page. Obviously, the API keys pages, we saw that one already, screenshot of that already. It's just really much more convenient for you to have direct access to the API keys page that for the keys you're trying to use, and so you can manage those things there. Next, in terms of understanding your account and licenses, make sure to understand the licenses themselves. Know which APIs they allow you to call and what specific abilities are included. Because we offer so many different licenses, distinguishing them can be tricky. Feel free to ask the support team or your sales rep about the abilities of any particular license. Just to give you an example, if you, as a developer, you think, oh, I want to do US address verification, I'm going to call the US street address API. But you could call that API with, for example, a US standard cloud license. You can call that API with a US core cloud license. You could call that API with a US rooftop geocoding cloud license. And so understanding the differences between those different types of subscriptions, those different licenses, will be essential. And again, reach out to the support team. We can help you if you have any questions on the abilities of any particular license you're trying to use, or how to call the APIs you're trying to call. Okay, jumping in then to common mistakes that result in a payment required error. Don't use API keys from the wrong account. That one seems kind of obvious. Many companies have multiple Smarty accounts, for example, a production account and several accounts used by individual developers. Make sure the auth credentials you are submitting in the request URL pertain to the account that actually has the right subscription in it. We definitely see this from time to time. A developer will be working in his or her own account to do some testing and things, and then they try to make a certain API call, and maybe their testing lookups have run out, and they're getting a payment required error because they're not using the credentials from the production account. So make sure that the credentials you're using pertain to the right account. Secondly, don't try to call an API that is not supported by one of your licenses. The most common example of this is you try to call the US Autocomplete Pro API, but you only have a US address verification subscription with a US Core Edition license. Our US Autocomplete service requires its own license. So this comes down to understanding what each license can do and which APIs it can call. If you try to call the Autocomplete API with a US Core license, you're going to get a payment required error. You'd have to have in your account the Autocomplete license. All right, next up, if using one of our SDKs, don't assume that the license value listed in the GitHub example code is the right one. For example, the default license listed in the GitHub example code might be US Rooftop Geocoding Cloud, but you don't actually have, what if you don't actually have a rooftop geocoding license? You may need to change the license value in the GitHub code to or in your code to US Core Cloud or US Standard Cloud, for example. And then I'm showing here a line from the JavaScript SDK, for example, in the GitHub example code from the JavaScript SDK in how to call our US Street Address API. The default license that's just sitting there is US Rooftop Geocoding Cloud, and you're in great shape if that's the actual license that you're trying to use, but you may need to change that to a different license value. Just be aware of that. I'm kind of going fast here, Andrew. Any questions to this point, or are we?
There are no questions coming up. I think a lot of people are just gleaning the information, and it's really, really good. Again, though, don't hold back any questions. If you guys have any, don't hesitate to use the Q&A or chat section of the Zoom webinar interface.
Okay, thank you. I am going through these things quickly. It's a lot of material to cover. Rely on the fact that we can send this to you. And in fact, we could also, if it's easier, rather than, we could send the video, but we can also send I'll make available a text version of all this information, just a text file that will have all this information in it that you could use, that you could consult as well. So you don't have to be taking copious notes. We can give it to you after the fact. All right, moving on. Another common mistake that could result in a payment required error is don't try to use an ability that doesn't pertain to your specific license. And I've got a few examples here. When calling our US Street Address API, if you include match equals enhanced in when you call the API, but you don't have a US Core Edition license. If you only have the older US Standard Edition license, you'll get a 402 because the US Standard Edition license doesn't allow enhanced matching. So that would be a case of you trying to use an ability that your license doesn't support. So again, it comes down to understanding the abilities that your particular license supports. Another example of abilities of the different licenses, when calling our International Street API, you include geocode equals true, but your license is an International Global Basic license that doesn't include geocodes. So not all our international plans include geocodes, and make sure if you need geocodes that you have a license that supports that, and then you would include geocode equals true, and you'd be in good shape. Again, if you try to include geocode equals true, but your license doesn't support it, you get the 402 payment required error. Next up, when calling our International Street API, you submit an address from a country that's not included with your particular license. We definitely have licenses, for example, that are specific to one country. Suppose you have a special license that's Canada only, and suppose that's the only international license in your account, and you try to submit an Australian or a UK address, for example, you get a payment required error. We also have plans that are called, for example, International Select Plus, which the International Select licenses exclude some more expensive countries. And if you have a select type of license, international license, and you try to call one of those expensive countries, you'd also get the payment required error. So again, to make sure you understand the abilities of your license, talk to us at support or your sales rep. Okay, wow, that's finishing up here. That was a lot of material. In a second, we'll have Q&A. Just understand the support team. We're here for you. We pride ourselves in being super responsive. Regular hours are weekdays, 8 to 5, Mountain Time. We're in Utah. There's our contact information. We typically answer the phone on the first or second ring, and you have a live human being that knows what they're doing in most cases. A lot of developers love our chat feature. It's an easy way to pass text strings back and forth, which is really useful when troubleshooting the kinds of errors that we've been talking about. And of course, there's the email. We pride ourselves, like I said, we pride ourselves on being super responsive. So reach out as often as you like. Guess we'll go ahead to our final slide. And Andrew, go ahead and where do we go from here?
Great. Thanks, Lyle. This has been fantastic. We do have a couple questions that are coming in. Before I grab these questions, though, I do want to address this slide. The intro slide out of melted ice cream cone. This is all a secret for making sure your ice cream cone stays where you want it. You can try our APIs if you aren't already using them. You can try them for free. Just go to smarty.com/signup and you can sign up for a free account and grab a bunch of free lookups. I think we offer 1,000 for regular verification. You can also get a whole bunch for geocoding. You can get some for the autocomplete API, all kinds of stuff there. So like I said, smarty.com/signup. All right, so let's jump into some of these questions. Number one, and a lot of this you may have already addressed. We just want to make sure, now that people have seen exactly what they're doing, they just have a couple of finite questions. So for the SDK, where do I find my license key?
So how do you know what license value to use, if that's the question? When you, again, logging into your Smarty account, looking at the subscriptions page, you'll see the license value to use for any particular subscription. So for example, the typical license value is US-core-cloud. That's maybe one of the most common. US-autocomplete-pro-cloud for the autocomplete API. You can find the specific license value to use in the request or in the SDK code. You find those license values in your subscriptions page. That's the easiest way to find them.
So log into your account and select subscriptions. Yeah. Okay, excellent. I believe you went over this at the beginning, but just as a refresher, can you briefly explain the difference between client-side request and server-side request?
For sure. Just think of it, is it coming from a browser or not? It's not quite as simple as that, because for mobile application, we would also recommend considering that like a client-side use case, because the mobile app code can be inspected. Basically, anytime code could be inspected, you want to use the client-side keys, the embedded key. Those are rate limited. That's one thing we do for security for those things. Server-side request is anything coming from server-side code. Typical, .NET, C#, Python, Java, JavaScript. You probably recognize as most commonly used in a client-side context. And so you most typically you're using JavaScript. You'd be in a client-side context. You'd be sending an embedded key. Mostly it comes down to if the request is being sent from a browser, it's a client. It should be treated as a client-side request. The browser is going to send a referrer header. That's how our system knows this is a client-side request. Hopefully that clears things up. Basically, it mostly comes down to is it in a browser or not?
Sure. Yeah, that's great. The next question is, can we talk about rate limits? How are the rate limits determined per API key?
Okay, rate limits, I won't be able to give just for the sake of time, that's a whole, I could give another presentation talking about 429 status codes, rate limit status codes, but let me give a kind of a quick summary of those things. There are two kinds of rate limits that you could possibly hit when calling our APIs. There's a security-based rate limit, which is per IP address. So for example, when you're calling, and this is for client-side requests only, you're calling us client-side, you're sending an embedded key. If you're at a certain IP address and hitting us repeatedly from that IP address with an embedded key, you'll get a security-based rate limit. We don't want anyone to be able to steal your key and then use that embedded key to get to program programmatically you steal your service. So we limit the number of requests you can send from a given IP address with the embedded key. Now, understand that doesn't limit. You could have 1 million customers, each at their own IP address, and you wouldn't be hitting any kind of rate limiting error, because the most typical client-side use case is, for example, online shopping or an online shopping cart situation. You could have thousands of customers on your website, each at their own IP address, and they're entering addresses, and you're sending requests from their IP address. You're not going to hit a rate limiting error there, because the security-based rate limit is a per IP rate limit. So that the last couple of minutes, that was talking specifically about security-based rate limits. Those are per IP address. In contrast, there are plan-based rate limits. So when you purchase, for example, an Autocomplete Pro API subscription, the plan itself may have a limit of 50 lookups per second, or a lot higher lookups per second, and that would be account-wide. That would be a total of all usage of all your keys. If you send more than the given number of lookups per second, you would hit a 429 rate limiting error.
Sure.
And there's a lot of specific. I don't have time here maybe to get into all the different contexts, but we're really happy to get on a phone call with you, like I say, or come into the chat and talk to us about your specific use case and any kind of follow-up questions you might have. Happy to work through those with you.
Okay, great. Just a couple more questions, and maybe the answer to some of these is visit smarty.com and chat in. But we'll take a shot at them anyway. Does the free trial for US address validation include enhanced matching?
It does. So these days, the plans that are available, the US address verification plans that are available on the website all include the enhanced matching. And okay. So when you start a free trial these days, it's going to be one of our current plans, and they all the current US address verification plans do include the enhanced matching.
Fantastic. Is there a way that I can see how many requests for a specific API have been sent?
We can provide you with a usage report. Eventually, this will be something that you can self-serve in your account when you log into the account. It's not there yet, but you can always reach out to us on the support team, and we can provide you, for example, a CSV file that says, it would list every hour, this is how many requests you sent a particular, using a particular license. And then, over a given time range. So for the last month, for example, how many requests you sent every hour, it'll give you a kind of semi-granular peek into your usage and how many requests you're sending. Hopefully that covers let me know if that's not enough of an answer, if you have any follow-up questions to that.
That's good. The last question, we're out of time. There's a couple more questions that have popped in. Again, I'm going to suggest that you visit smarty.com and just click the little chat bubble in the bottom right-hand corner. We're happy to take some of these questions offline. The last question we'll take for now is, for some addresses, the API is returning an empty JSON object. Is that a normal thing, or is that something we'll need to contact support and troubleshoot?
So that is expected behavior, but it's fairly easy to explain this. When you call our US street address API with an address, if that address is not recognized by the API, maybe for whatever reason, it's just you fat fingered it, or it's just not a valid address for some reason, at least according to the data we have, it's not a valid address. The default response is an empty array. So empty set of brackets, right? You'll see that, and sometimes, and that is in the documentation, but it still catches people off guard to say, well, why is that just an empty response? That's the default, but many people would prefer to see some feedback about the address, even when it's invalid. Simply set match. If you have one of our older US standard licenses, just set match equals invalid in the query string, match equals invalid, and then you'll see output even if the address is invalid. Similarly, if you have one of our newer US core licenses or US rooftop geocoding licenses, we'd recommend including a match parameter of match equals enhanced, and then you'll always see some output even if the address is invalid.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Lyle. This has been fantastic. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We hope that you got what you were hoping to get out of this session. Feel free to grab a free trial if you haven't already, and don't forget to chat into the smarty.com chat to contact support and troubleshoot any errors that you may be having. We hope you guys have a great day, and you join us on our next webinar. We'll see you guys next time.